Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As we approach midlife, we find that sometimes things just work a little bit slower than they used to. After all, rebuilding, replenishing, and repairing just don't seem to be as quick as it used to be when we were children, teenagers, and young adults. What can we do when we can get back to that source, when we can be able to rebound better than we used to? Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is author of the book, The Perfect Metabolism Plan, How to Restore Your Energy and Reach Your Ideal Weight in Just 31 Days. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Sarah Vance. Sarah, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Daniel.
Now, how did you start all this? What was your motivation here? I mean, those are always interesting stories.
You know, my motivation is kind of twofold. When I was younger, I was kind of on the other side of health. I struggled with my own weight when I was in elementary school, and then even though I was able to level out my weight as I got older, I suffered with a lot of other health problems, from chronic aches and pains and foggy brain and a number of different things. So I've been on the other side of health, and when I really kind of discovered the power of food and, how to change my health, it really spurred me on to want to help other people. And then as I was learning about, all of these, truths of nutrition as I was attending nutrition school, I realized, oh my goodness, we all just have bad information. There's so much misinformation out there about nutrition and health, and so much of the advice that we've been given, as far as how to, level out our weight and reach our, ideal weight is just wrong, and that's what really motivated me to put this book together. It's a totally different approach to, fixing our weight imbalances. And the great thing about it is that it's not just going to fix our weight, it fixes so many other things. So
I like, your message, it's not your fault, but it's really your metabolism. Tell us about that.
Exactly. It's so interesting because I think so many of us believe, that we're doomed to just have our metabolism slow down after we hit age 40. And, so we may as well just kind of settle into the couch. And the thing about it is it really, the good news is that a lot of the reasons that our metabolism slows down are in our control. And that's what I've done with this book, is to really outline 10 keys that we need to kind of get. I think about them as dominoes. If one domino falls down, then it all kind of tumbles the rest of them down. And so when we can line these things back up, it starts to really get our metabolism, working again. Our body's very holistic, and we need all these factors to work together. So that's why, rather than counting calories or points and those things, it's really fixing these 10 different keys to the metabolism to get it working again.
I know as you shared your story, especially in the book, that you talk about how the body is resoundingly resilient. And it's pretty amazing when you allow the opportunity by doing really the right things that are very individual, what kind of changes can really occur. Tell us about that.
Oh, it's so true. Our bodies are designed to, detoxify and work together. And, for example, one of the things I tell people to do is, rather than counting calories, counting chemicals. And one of the chapters in my book is about how to detox the body, because that's so important to our metabolism. In fact, there are certain chemicals that are added to foods that are basically called obesogens because they program the body to store fat. They create obesity. So I think it's understanding how all these work together. Like, for example, stress. When we allow stress to overcome us, other things it's like a cascade of problems. Our digestion doesn't work as well, and so all these checks and balances that can help the body can sometimes, cause a cascade of, negative problems. So it's amazing that when we do give the body what it needs, and when we support the body to detoxify and support it by lowering stress, then it just, the body really responds, and so it is amazing.
Now, here's one that was really interesting to me. It just popped right out, and I thought it was kind of funny because, I went through this a little bit, but, I also had a very doting mother when it came to this particular teenage challenge, and that is one of acne. And you talk about how that's one of those things, those signs that tells you that you are possibly in what's known as a food intolerance. Tell us about that.
Yes, there's so many signs of food intolerances. That's one, and a lot of times that can also be a signal that your digestive health is not in good order, and those go hand in hand. I always kind of say it's like the chicken or the egg thing. Which came first, the gut issue or the food intolerance? And sometimes it can be a combination of both. That's really foundational to our health, our gut, and when our gut is not in good shape, the skin is kind of the window to our gut health. If we've got rosacea or acne or all these other things happening on our skin, rather than putting creams on it, we should look to heal the gut, and that involves figuring out, are there foods that we're intolerant to? And part of my book is to help people to understand what are some foods that we can remove to just some of the more common food intolerances. And I explain the difference between a true food allergy and a food intolerance, because those are different. And a lot of people think, well, if I don't have symptoms of digestive problems, then I'm fine. But food intolerances can show up in many ways, from skin problems to foggy brain, and even things like ADHD and so chronic aches and pains, which was something that I suffered from. And I could always explain them off. Oh, well, my wrist is bothering me because I've been using the computer too much, or my hip flexors are bothering me because I've been sitting. It's easy to shrug these things off, but when I've cleaned up my diet and figured out what I was intolerant to, those things went away. And so it can be life-changing when you approach your health this way. It's funny because I had someone that read the book and said, I almost didn't buy this book because I thought it was about weight, and it's so much more than that. It really is about transforming your health. I view weight as just a symptom, of an imbalanced metabolism, along with many other symptoms. So.
Well, and the reason I brought that up, Sarah, is this, because it's one of those things that we believe, or we are led to believe anyway, that we're just supposed to go through. It's a stage, teenagers get acne, their faces create a little extra oil because they're growing, their skin is stretching, it's supposed to be pliable, and that's the way it is. But the fact is that's really not a good sign.
Right.
When you take a look at teenagers, not all of them are getting pimples.
Exactly. That's it's a good question. I definitely think, again, looking to the gut to heal the gut. Some kids, they are going through some hormonal changes, and hormones can affect that. But I think a lot of times, cleaning up the gut, getting control of the blood sugar, that's a big one for kids, nowadays in that age range. They're getting more sugar than anybody else, or the teenagers, So those kinds of things, sugar and the skin is massive. When you can really get the blood sugar under control, that's also going to affect the skin and the gut, So definitely looking to the gut and healing that is so key.
Now, it's interesting because you were mentioning earlier in the program that we just don't, sometimes we actually deal with a lot of misinformation. And interestingly enough, my wife and I were talking the other day, and she says, God, you really look into this nutrition thing, and it gets so confusing about what the right thing is to do. And I said, why don't you just back off looking into the information, for instance, because that's exactly what it is. I found myself in that same conundrum, if you will, back in the early part of the 1990s, because it seemed everybody on a cable station or television station, radio, magazine, whatever the case is, had the system or the information where they were in the know about what the right thing was to do when it came to diet, nutrition, that sort of a thing. And I got so frustrated with the push-me-pull-you situation. One day vitamin E was the way to go. It was the restoration that would find that ultimate vibrant health that you were supposed to have. And then the next day, scientists find that it's not really a good thing for you to have too much or any kind of vitamin E whatsoever. One day, you need to cut back on your caffeine. The next day, you should have 2 to 3 cups of coffee a day, to be able to it was so contradictory. So I finally got so frustrated with it, I just put it aside and I said, I'm going to go and find out with reason, what is the good thing to do? And as we were talking, I said, well, take a look at, for instance, France. Everybody applauds France or looks at it with a lot of reverence because, of their cooking their food. And I said, well, if you really take a look at it, France's attitude, especially when it comes to diet, is that they eat to enjoy life, so to speak. It's fresh food, fresh ingredients just brought together. You see a lot of butter in their recipes, that sort of a thing. Whereas in the United States, we seem to have this code for food where it's about fuel, it's about nutrition, things like that. And I think what we really need to do, and you certainly outline this in your book, is we need to have a new approach to what this is all about.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, that's part of the reason why I wrote this book. I kind of view this book as sort of Nutrition 101. It's for the person that is like, yeah, I'm frustrated. I'm hearing all this misinformation and conflicting information. We spent decades being told that fat is unhealthy for us, and all we have to do is look at the French, and they used to call it the French paradox. Why can the French be so healthy eating all this fat?
Yeah, well, they're never ever actually overweight either, and I know because I've been to the country.
Yeah, and it's interesting because what we're realizing now is fat is actually, and I find this to be absolutely true. This is one of the biggest messages that I communicate with my clients, and it's chapter 2 in my book is we have to understand that fat is not bad for us. There are certain fats we want to avoid, things like trans fats and some of the industrialized fats. But, I find that when people start to reintroduce fats in their diet, their health just gets more in balance. We need fats to absorb fat-soluble vitamins, and, we could be nutrient deficient if we're not getting enough healthy fats. A lot of people are, in my age range, are losing their gallbladder because they've been on these extreme low-fat diets, and it's so critical because, I find I do a lot of, I have an online course that's about breaking up with sugar. That's my chapter 1, and I find if people have been following this low-fat diet, that's where their blood sugar is out of control because you need fat, healthy fat, to level out your blood sugar, to keep your hunger hormones in balance. I talk about hormones a lot in this book, about how hormones are really critical, because they are the drivers of our hunger signals and our appetite, and they're driving how we're managing sugars and carbs and things like that. And when those things get out of balance, when our hormones are not communicating effectively, I kind of talk about it like that telephone game. You play that telephone game and the message gets delivered, but it doesn't get heard in the right way. And so when our hormones get out of balance, and, that can really get things off track. So really it's, I think people are frustrated with all the misinformation and the conflicting information, and that's why I've taken this approach where it's not about counting calories and all of that, and it's more about teaching people, okay, this is what your body is really needing, and this is how this affects that, and it's sort of that domino effect, and how our bodies are very holistic. We can't just do one thing, like looking at one symptom or weight. You take the whole body, and that's the thing, is when you're taking an approach like this, not only can you get your weight back in balance, but you're lowering your risk of diseases and all other kinds of things that we're looking to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you talk about fat, that's certainly one of those things here in America that we seem to battle, one day again. It's something that's not good for you. It's a leading cause of obesity and heart disease, things like that. But then on the other hand, the next day somebody says, well, it's really good for you, but you got to be careful about whether it's, low fat or good fat, whatever the case is. And you talk about something in the book that's really fascinating, and that is one Dr. Ansel Keys who did a study on this. And you talk about how he actually took a look at something like more than 20 countries, but he only reported on 7. Tell us about that story.
Yeah, it's a very interesting history of how the whole low-fat craze came into being, and I do go into that in the book, but, he was really he was the driver of the whole low-fat era, and he presented this thing called the 7 countries study. Well, he had actually looked at over 20 countries, but cherry-picked the 7 countries that fit his theory. And the interesting thing, the reason why he went into to look into fat and heart disease was because heart disease was virtually non-existent, a few decades around the turn of the century, 1900s. And then all of a sudden, within a couple of decades, it was, had really risen to be one of the major causes of death. And so he said, well, I want to find this out. I want to figure out what's going on with this. And he had this theory that it was saturated fat and cholesterol that was causing this. And so he set out to prove his theory. And the first time he presented it at a conference, he was laughed at. And so he's like, I'm going to go back to the drawing board and figure this out again. And he presented this 7-country study. The other thing about his study was that it wasn't based on causation. It was based on correlation. So, all these recommendations that we have had to eat low fat have been really largely based on what he's found. And there's been many, many studies that have disproved that theory. And in fact, there were people at the time who disagreed with what he presented and believed that, how can you say it's fat when there's no causation, there's only correlation. And many people believed it was actually sugar that was causing the problems in the rise in heart disease. But those people were kind of quieter people. They weren't as vocal, and he was very connected. And so it's very interesting looking back at this and to see like how many decades we've followed these recommendations to load up on the grains and cut back on our fats. And what has that really done? It's actually made our health worse if you look at the statistics. And but it's this mental concept that we've had this just like forced into our brains, and it takes a lot of shift. But if you read up on what's current in nutrition, you'll see that there's a lot out there now that experts are talking about how fat is really critical to our health in many, many ways. And I find when people start to get more fat in their diet, at first it's this really hard kind of shift, but then they start to feel better and they start to crave less sugar and they start to feel more, their blood sugar is more stable, their appetite's more stable, their hormones start to come into balance, their mood, it's really important for our brain health and our mood to get enough healthy fats as well. And skin, amazing benefits to the skin. I always tell my women friends who are my age, I say, I view it kind of like a beauty nutrient because that healthy fat helps to get rid of those dry, cracked heels and, just makes our skin look so much healthier, especially when we get rid of that sugar. Sugar's, the worst thing for wrinkling and all of that, so.
I was just recently in a bulk foods supermarket, and boy, I'll tell you, there was just slight of being appalled. I was watching people push around their shopping carts, and I would take a look at what was in their cart, and then I would take a look at the person pushing the cart, and I just couldn't help but think, it's only a matter of time unless you begin to make some changes that things aren't going to be very good for you. And it just astounds me what I see in shopping carts.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that because one time I was at one of the bulk food stores and I saw a person pushing one of the flatbread, the big ones, not even just the cart, the flat carts that, can put all kinds of stuff on. And they were getting this grain-free dog food for their dog and then, in the other hand, eating this giant croissant and having a box of croissants, for themselves. And I said, you're feeding your dog better than you're feeding yourself. Your dog is on this fabulous, grain-free diet with salmon and all this wonderful, and then, it's tough. And I think a lot of, the problem is, we're relying on these convenience foods. And, I think one of it's a big thing. There's a big aspect, a mental aspect to making changes in our lives. And I think a lot of us are resistant to change because we're used to our habits and we like our routines and we feel like we need these foods to function. And a lot of times people have this resistance to, I'm going to be deprived when I go through this program. And what I really find is when people do this, they're happier than they've ever been in their lives. They have more energy. My book is actually based on, it started out kind of as a group cleanse I was doing here locally, and I actually have some people all around the country doing it as well. And I remember there have been people who have told me, oh my gosh, I've never been happier in my life. So rather than thinking about making these changes in your life as being negative or you're being deprived, it can change your everything to make you have more energy than you've ever had and a better attitude towards life. And you feel like, better than you've ever felt before in your life. And I've had people tell me, I didn't know, like, I could feel this good. So I think a lot of times, that it's that turning that switch on, saying, rather than looking at it from, I'm going to be deprived, I'm going on this diet. I mean, when I was a young child, I was put on diets all the time to try and get me to lose weight. And I can remember making myself like a juicy peanut butter and jelly sandwich right before I went to meet with this dietitian and thinking, it's, my last something before I'm going to be deprived for the next 3 weeks. And that's the thing is, my book has all these delicious and just rich and, very satisfying recipes. And so you're, rather than thinking about it being a negative thing, it's such a positive thing. I've even had someone join my program one time who literally was so tired, couldn't even fold her own laundry or cook, and I said, well, just give it a try, do what you can do. And, within a week or so, she was back to doing things that she couldn't do before because she was so exhausted. And so, I think it's tough to change. We're used to our normal foods and routines, but you're right. I mean, we're headed for something not good unless we do make these changes when we're eating all these convenience foods.
Now, coming up on our program is a gentleman that's going to be talking about how he was able to reverse the symptoms of his 70-year-old mother's emphysema.
Wow.
And as you read this book, it was astounding what this gentleman really did. And it was mostly regarding changing her diet by eliminating things that she was doing. Now, this was also someone who was a smoker for many years. But that was eliminated, and he started puzzling over the fact, well, if that component has been removed, what is going on that this seems to be progressive, seems to continue? And talked about how the industry of medicine that was treating her mother, or his mother, was pretty much prescribing things that would slow that process down. It wouldn't reverse it, it wouldn't cure it, it would just slow it down. And he says that made no sense. Now, anybody who hears the word emphysema knows this is a progressive disease that isn't curable, so we're led to believe. Yet he took and was able to get his mother from a point where she was on 3 liters of oxygen and barely could get out of bed to go to the bathroom, much less do anything else, to a point she was jumping into the car and driving to the store 17 months later on her own without supplemental oxygen at all.
That's amazing.
And it really is, but pretty much everything he was doing was he began to do a process of elimination of things that were in her diet. One of the biggest ones was sugar. And that is because he was talking about particular pathogens in the cells, for instance, like cancer. These particular pathogens or cells seem to have more receptors than any other cell for being able to get a hold of sugar. So he reasoned that, well, if these things thrive on sugar, what if I begin to eliminate sugar from the diet? We're talking about direct sugar or foods that convert into a type of sugar. In other words, I'm going to starve this to death. And so that was the first step, and then he just did this process of elimination. So it got to a point she had eliminated all of her medications. And again, got off the supplemental oxygen, and he literally reversed the emphysema. This wasn't a doctor. This was a guy who was an engineer most of his life. And I look at your book, and you say the same thing about sugar, that this here is a hardcore culprit. And as I was describing the bulk food shopper, and I'm sure we've all seen this, you realize a predominant amount of those manufactured produced foods seem to contain sugar, corn syrup, one thing or another. That certainly seems to be one thing that if we began to eat fresher, that we would just naturally eliminate sugar. Tell us the importance of that.
Oh, yeah. Daniel, I mean, it's number one. It's interesting because when I was writing my book and when I first turned in my manuscript to my publisher, my editor bristled a little bit and says, well, do we really need to come out and put sugar as chapter number 1? I mean, she knows how much we love our sugar, and it's really one of those things that, she was like, I don't know if we should hit people over the head with that, and I said, it's number 1. It's really absolutely the number 1 thing we need to do to get our health in order, to get our metabolism working again, and to be feeling better. And it's really probably the best thing anyone can do for lowering their risk of diseases. I mean, it's excess sugar is linked to almost every major non-communicable disease. And we're seeing kids today, 1 in 10 kids have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and that's from excess consumption, mostly of high fructose corn syrup and sugar. And that's not even the overweight kids. That's all kids. We have 40% of overweight, obese kids with fatty liver disease, and they don't know it, And so it's really an important thing. And again, it's one of those things where once you get past it, you feel better than you've ever felt. And what I tell people about sugar is that once you have gotten off of sugar, you don't even want it anymore. You don't like super sweet things. You've literally changed your taste buds, your hormones. One of the most important hormones for our metabolism is insulin. If our body, when we eat too much sugar and foods that convert to sugar, the high glycemic foods, our insulin receptors aren't working anymore, so we're not really even processing it well, and that creates a cascade of problems. And so, yeah, I would say absolutely number 1. And I put fats as chapter 2 because they work hand in hand. Part of the reason we're in this problem where more than 50% of the population has blood sugar problems, it's because we've been eating all this low-fat stuff. And yeah, you were saying that so much of this convenience foods and these packaged foods have sugar in them. Well, pretty much 75% of all foods that are, packaged or processed have added sugar, and that's because manufacturers know we love it, and they know we're addicted, and they want to keep us addicted. And, sugar's highly addictive. It's as addictive as a drug. It is a drug. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, we're kind of in this cycle of we're hooked on this stuff. We can't get off it. And, we need to break that cycle. And once you do, it's life-changing. That was actually one of the things I did about 5 or 6 years ago, was to get off sugar. And I didn't realize that, my sugar was different sugar. It wasn't, the candy and that kind of thing. It was pretzels, diet sodas. Those are just as bad for your metabolism, if not worse. I was a wheat girl. I ate tons of whole grain wheat stuff, and, I thought I was being healthy, and come to find out, wait a minute, these things are all, harming my personal health. And a lot of the book is also helping people figure that out for themselves. Are food intolerance is a problem for you? Helping teach people, like you were saying, that it doesn't even have to be sugar. It could be just foods that are converting to sugar, and helping people to really understand that and what are those foods, and the hidden sugars, how artificial sweeteners can be impacting our metabolism, and the whole wheat thing. Wheat is a big one as far as blood sugar and food intolerances. So.
Mm-hmm. Wheat, too, is especially one of those things that seem to add a lot of confusion to people this day and age when it comes to the gluten intolerance scenario. Now, here's an interesting thing. I've got a friend of mine who is a chef of a prominent restaurant, and she has a gluten intolerance, if you will. But this is somebody who's been in the industry for a very long time and really understands food. And just recently, she took a trip to Europe, excuse me, and she was over there going crazy with the breads, just going nuts. And her friends were like, what is this? What are you doing here? We don't usually see this kind of behavior in you. And she says, well, in America, I can't do this very much, and that is because I have a gluten intolerance. Well, what are you doing? Because isn't that supposed to have gluten? She says, yeah, but there's a difference. The way wheat is produced in Europe is much different than the United States.
Mm.
We all know about the GMO, so to speak,
right.
genetically modified organism. Wheat, when that became a GMO, it changed the structure of the gluten within the plant. And that is what people are beginning to have a reaction from. Versus in Europe, it's very naturally grown, and they don't tolerate, any kind of GMO whatsoever. And I find that interesting because that's one of those things that people hear information, they think, maybe I have that. Pretty soon they tend to look for and experience the symptoms from, let's say a gluten intolerance, and so they begin to believe the information they're hearing. So I find it always fascinating that in a country we live in that does what they do and then tells us we should stay away from that. And you think to yourself, again, it's like I was saying earlier in the program, it becomes very frustrating. What is the right thing to do? But the bottom line is what you talk about, in your book, The Perfect Metabolism Plan, is it's individual. What are you experiencing? If before you weren't doing this and all of a sudden you were doing this thing and you're having this particular kind of an experience, it stands to reason, just don't do it anymore.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Yeah, you bring up so many good points. About the whole listening to your body and tuning in. I mean, I do a lot of kids nutrition and come in and I do school assemblies. And one of the things I talk to them about is listening to your body. How does this food make you feel 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 2 hours after you eat it? If you can just connect to that, I mean, there are people who live their whole lives and make no connection between what they're eating and how they're feeling. And that's one of the reasons why in the book I teach people about doing a food elimination diet. I call it the Grand Central Station phenomenon, actually. Because our bodies are so resilient and our bodies are designed to try and reach this state of equilibrium and homeostasis, that if we are eating foods that we're intolerant to, the body learns to kind of just cobble along, to kind of keep those symptoms down and to we learn to tune them out, right? And so what happens is, in order to really identify these intolerances, what we can do is we remove those foods for a short period of time, and then our body can, start to, feel what it feels like to not have them, and then you reintroduce them, and the body, it's louder. It's like you turn up the volume. Like if you're sitting in Grand Central Station and you drop a pin, you're not going to hear that. But if you go into a quiet room and you drop a pin, you will hear it. So your body is able to hear these responses, these reactions to these foods when you take it away. You get to feel what it feels like again to feel good, and so many of us just think it's normal. I thought it was normal. The years and years I suffered with food intolerances, I thought it was normal to just pop Advil all day long. I had an Advil bottle upstairs and one downstairs, and I just thought that was normal for me. I thought it was normal, even though I was in my 30s, to have hip problems. I mean, how is that normal to have hip problems in your 30s? But, you accept these things. You think that's just how I am. And, and it's, you don't have to accept these things. I've learned that, you have to be a little bit of a nutrition detective. You have to start listening to your body and be willing to make changes. And that's not easy. And so, but a lot of times what I tell people is, especially with these food intolerances, people are so resistant to try to remove wheat because it's so prevalent in our diets. A lot of people say, well, what do I eat? And it's a process. But I say, what do you have to lose? Well, I'll tell you what I had to lose: chronic aches and pains, mood imbalances, foggy brain, excess weight. I look back at pictures of myself, 10, 15 years ago, and I just looked puffy. I just didn't, feel 100%. And so, even though I'm 15 years older now, I feel better than I did, when I was younger. And that's because I eat clean. My body is thriving more because I'm giving it what it needs. And so I think that's, it's a hard thing to get to make change. And a lot of times you hear of people having to really hit bottom and having to have a wake-up call. And rather than waiting for that wake-up call, wake yourself up and say, you know what, I'm going to do something today, and I'm going to make these changes because I want to feel great. I know I can, and believing that, you can get there to a place where you're not relying on Advil like I was relying on Advil to get through my day, and I can't remember the last time I took an Advil. It's crazy.
Well, and that's one of those things, too, where, on the one hand, you want to be careful about using aspirin unless you have a headache. Now, all of a sudden, you're seeing commercials that are touting, well, an aspirin a day keeps heart disease away. And I'm thinking, what kind of nonsense is this?
And they go back and forth on that one, don't they?
They certainly do, but then you look at the motivation. It's the same thing with milk. Milk, allegedly, drink your milk, okay, for instance. Now, this is one that I've got to hit on, and it's important, and I know that you talk about this in your book as well, but, you see these billboards, the little milk mustache, and the athletes or the movie stars, whatever the case is, drink your milk, and it shows to be one of those builders of calcium. Of course, well, especially in women, we want to avoid osteoporosis, so drink milk. Well, that's nonsense, because there was a time where I was having stomach problems, where I was, having stomach aches, and that was something that I was using to more alleviate that, more than I was actually using milk on a regular basis. So what happens is I had this, what was known as a body talk practitioner, on the program, and what I was hearing from this guest was pretty interesting about what this guest does, which is listening to the body, like what you talk about so adamantly in your book, The Perfect Metabolism Plan. But so I decided to go see this person, and she starts doing a little evaluation, just quietly listening, touching me in certain parts, and she says, your body is telling me, and I thought that was interesting by itself, but she says, your body is telling me it has an aversion and just doesn't like milk. And I thought that was interesting because it seemed for quite a few years I eliminated milk. We're just talking, the drinking milk, not dairy, but milk, out of my diet. I just didn't have it at all. And then all of a sudden it seemed like I decided to reintroduce it. I started feeling that inflammation in my stomach, that burning pain, that sort of a thing, so I would drink it to alleviate that, and it would work. And the thing was, she's saying, well, your body's saying it doesn't like it too much. I decided from that moment I'm just going to eliminate milk. Now, I still like my cheese, for certain things, but it's something that I do very infrequently. It isn't like I eat cheese every day. And I did that simple thing, and I'll tell you, within just a couple of days, that stomach pain went away and hasn't been back. And I found that astounding that my body was telling somebody else, would you tell this idiot to get off the milk? But, it's so interesting, that when you start looking at the motivations behind the message, you begin to understand, maybe this isn't so true. For instance, the milk, the billboard commercials, that sort of a thing, tells you, but what is the motivation behind the message? Well, of course, it's the Dairy Council trying to sell milk, and that just isn't really a good thing for us.
Yeah, there's so many different components of milk that can be a problem for people. I mean, there's the lactose, there's the casein, there's it's a tough one, and a lot of it also could be the way it's processed. I mean, a lot of the cows are being fed genetically modified alfalfa. It's very difficult to find non-genetically modified alfalfa. It's one of the most highly. So there a lot of them are getting the hormones and the so there's so many different things that we could be reacting to milk, and again it comes back to that chicken or the egg thing. Was the gut inflammation there, or is it the milk causing the gut inflammation? But regardless, the way to heal the gut is to remove these foods that cause issues. And again, listen to the body and say, "Wow, oh my gosh, I haven't had my stomach problems, that I've suffered with for years." And it's sort of an investigative process. My family, I've been off of dairy for years, and recently was able to find a raw goat farm nearby where I'm getting milk from them, and that's working for our family, but that's not easy to find, So I think you have to kind of explore. Some people do better with goat's milk. Some people do better with raw cow's milk because it has more of the natural lactose, which is helping people to digest it. A lot of people don't have the enzymes to digest milk, and so it just, it takes a little investigation. And the interesting thing about some food intolerances, like you were saying, you're okay if you just do a little cheese here and there. sometimes that is the case that, a food intolerance sometimes is dose dependent. Not for all things. Gluten I wouldn't say is necessarily in that category because a lot of people react to even minute amounts of it. But, dairy can sometimes be in that category. I'm one of those people that occasionally will have a little bit of dairy. I err more towards the goat's cheese because I find that's easier on the digestion. But, if I have a little here and there, maybe a little Parmesan on something, it doesn't seem to bother me as much. And cheese is a little bit different in how the body's processing it. But, I think a lot of it has to do, and back to the wheat conversation about, I didn't touch on that part about how a lot of times in Europe people can eat wheat and they can't eat it here. I know people who order flour from Europe because they can eat the breads and things that they make from the European flour. And I think a lot of it has to do with how in our country we've hybridized it to such a degree that we've raised the polypeptides in it that cause this addictive reaction and cause our blood sugar to spike higher. In the United States we add so much more gluten to our breads than have ever been in our breads and things before. And the interesting thing about one of the newer things, I don't even think I have this in my book, is it really the gluten we're reacting to, or is it what they're doing to our wheat at our harvesting? Because what's happening is farmers, when they harvest wheat, they douse it with glyphosate, which is a pesticide. And the reason they do that is because it basically kills the wheat, so it's easier to harvest. And so we're eating, and recently there's been some research that's come out saying that glyphosate is a potential carcinogen, and there's a lot of research showing that it does damage to our gut. And think about it, for decades we were told, eat more grains. It's the foundation of that food pyramid that they finally got rid of. So what are we doing? We're eating all this, wheat that's been treated with glyphosate. So I tell people, if you choose to have wheat in your diet, make sure it's organic. As much as you can if you're going to choose to have it, because in organic wheat, they can't douse it with glyphosate. They're not allowed to use pesticides on it. And, because one of the trouble with going gluten-free is if you go rush out and buy all these gluten-free foods, well, those are filled with, starches and genetically modified ingredients. And so it's not really necessarily going to be healthier to try and eat the same way you've been eating before, but just replacing, all your breads and things like that with gluten-free items, because in some cases there's some good options, but in other cases they, may not be any better for you. So yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think, thinking about just a lot of times these changes aren't going to happen overnight. It's a process, and allowing your body time and allowing your routine time to change, and again, exploring these things. A lot of times I used to wake up and have a bowl of cereal, and now I have a smoothie instead. A lot of times for lunch I would have a sandwich, and now I'll have a lot of times a salad or soup or something else. And then occasionally still having like a gluten-free pasta or something like that. But not, it's not the same part of my diet that it used to be. But there's lots of ways to replace gluten in a healthy way using coconut flour and almond flour, and so yeah.
Speaking of replacing, that was one of the things that I did when it came to recipes, was to replace milk that was called for in recipes with almond or coconut milk. And right. I can tell the listeners out there is no difference in the recipe.
Oh yeah, a lot of times there's no difference.
And I found that once in a great while, I like to go ahead and have a little bowl of cereal, but it's not something that I really have in the house very often. And I used an almond milk for that, and it was a little waterier than what you're used to, because I grew up actually right across the street from a dairy farm, so we were used to getting whole milk from across the street. Mm-hmm. I couldn't stand any milk that was in a store. So I'd have to get anything close to it, get like vitamin D whole milk instead of this 2% nonsense that they sell. And it's garbage. I mean, just the taste of it, the smell of it, I'm like, how do people drink this? Well, because it's a low-fat milk, and it's like, no, I'm sorry, there's certain words that I could use, but I won't here on the program. But the fact is, when I made that replacement, and again, I'm just by like maybe a quart, something even smaller, because I just don't use that much, but I replaced dairy milk with that kind of milk. And really, it wasn't hard to get used to, and you really, truly, as you were talking about in the book, get used to listening to your body. How does it feel? What is it saying to you? And there was no difference, and I actually just felt better, and it really wasn't that hard. And that's really what you talk about through this whole book, is that you're talking about resetting, that let's take a look at how you're feeling and what led you to get to that point where you feel the way you do, if, in fact, you're not feeling very good. Take some of those things out. And maybe some of these things that you took out, like, for instance, you were talking about eggs. Some people think, well, I was told that if I eat a lot of eggs, it's going to go ahead, it's going to run my cholesterol through the roof, so I need to eliminate those things. But the fact is, eggs are actually very, very, very good for you. But you need to have more of the free range, the more natural thing, instead of the caged birds that we tend to get eggs from. But the point is that you actually, in your book, you use such simplicity when it comes to communicating this message of, listen to your body. It's at a point now that maybe you don't like so much. What's causing that? What are you doing? Take that stuff out and then maybe reintroduce things that were better for you in the first place. And as you said just now, it takes time. The fact is, when you start feeling aches and pains, those things just don't happen right away. It's over a course of time that you begin to feel these. These are those subtle alarms that can become very large, loud alarms if you don't pay attention or you choose to ignore them. And that's all you have to do, is just reverse it, and gently, you begin to change your habits. And that's really what it's all about, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's such a good point that, these things can start very quiet and then the volume gets turned up, and a little minor annoyance becomes a major health problem. And I love, that whole analogy of listen to these signals and make these changes before you end up with a major health crisis. And I think one of the things I always say about any kind of change is you need 3 really critical things. You need good information, and that's why I created this book. I really wanted to give people the information that is going to help them get to the place where they want to be. And it's not the typical stuff that you're getting when you're trying to reach a healthy weight or achieve your vibrant health. It's different steps. It's not just counting calories or the second, so you have the awareness, the information. You need to be aware about what's going on in your body. You have to have good information. The second thing is motivation. What is it that motivates us to make change? Is it that maybe we've got an event coming up and we want to fit in this dress that we've been wanting to wear? Or, is it that a friend of ours just came down with heart disease and, wow, gosh, all of a sudden this is my contemporary that's dealing with this problem, or maybe it is your own health problem or crisis. Whatever it is, finding that place that, what is this thing? What's your why? What is really driving you to do this? And if, making that connection to it, really making it real. And then the other thing are the tools. The tools are the recipes. It's easy for me to say, well, you should be eating chia seed and coconut oil, but, if I can tell you how to do that, put your coconut oil in your tea in the morning, or, put your chia seed in your smoothie. And so when you have these recipes, and so that's one of the reasons why I gave so many recipes in the book, is because I love food, I love to eat, and, my book is not about, deprivation. It's about loving food and changing how you're eating and what the things you crave. And it's so funny because when I was a kid, I loved sugar and I loved hot dogs. I was actually a really picky eater, and I didn't like vegetables at all. And now, it's so funny when I'm cooking vegetables for my family, my husband's like swatting my hand as I'm like stealing them off the pan. He's like, save some for the rest of the family. My 12-year-old me would just be rolling on the floor laughing if she knew that I wrote a book about nutrition and, was sneaking vegetables before I served them to the family. So we can change. We absolutely can change, and we just have to get that, the 3-pronged stool, really understand, get that good information, really find our deep motivation, and have those tools and put a support system in place for yourself. I think that once you have that, then the world is yours. You can do it.
Well, and the most important thing too, Sarah, because again, I want to reiterate the fact that your book has such simplicity to it. The reader won't feel that they're being preached to or told what the right thing to do is. You have more of a way as, let's throw this out there. What do you think? And people can begin to reason what the right thing or the good thing is for them to do and quit listening to experts so much. That's the thing. I just had a guest recently that we were talking about that very thing, that we've gotten to a point in our society, and if you look on YouTube, it totally affirms what I'm about to say here, but we've gotten to a point that we have surrendered our personal power to people that we believe know more and know what is better for us than we do, to the point that we need to be led by somebody else to tell us how to feel better. Don't you find that just seems to be unreasonable? And what I was going to point out about YouTube is one of the most searched things people look for is, how do I do this? Have we become a society, I guess, that has gotten to the point we just don't think for ourselves anymore? And that's what I love about your book, is that it just outlines, hey guys, just take a look at this and see what you think. You don't come from a perspective of being an expert, knowing better for somebody than they do. You just simply say, hey, let's just take a look at this and see what you think. Go ahead and go this direction and see what the outcome is, and get people to start thinking again.
Yeah, it's so important. What I wanted to really do is, make it so approachable and really share my story, because I've been in that place. I was, hooked on sugar for many years, not even realizing it. I was, exercising too much and thinking that was healthy, and, one of the chapters in my book is about being smarter about it. And so what I wanted to do is really kind of organize these 10 keys that I have figured out over the years and through my education and just my own experience in working with clients and doing these group programs, realize that, wow, these things, once you get these things lined up, it can really be life-changing forever. A lot of times, people, when I first started doing my group cleanse, people are like, Sarah, you should do a cleanse. We want to cleanse for a week or 2 or 3 or whatever. And when I started to put it together, I said, nobody just wants to cleanse for 3 weeks. They want to change their life. They want to really understand how to make these things stick and to really feel good and not to have these cravings. A lot of, what happens when you take this process is, your body, your hormones change, everything changes, your energy, your sleep, and so when you can really get your metabolism working again, I find it can become effortless. It's not a struggle. You don't have to really rely on willpower because you're getting all these other functions working together in your body. When you get that stress under control, then your digestion can start to come into balance again, and your sleep, and so it's all connected. And so, just to singularly do one thing like counting calories, that's like putting a broken arm in a sling.
That person who came up with that idea should be jailed.
That's
got to be one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard of, and that's just my opinion. But really, counting calories? Who came up with the idea of calorie in the first place? Well,
the interesting thing is, if you think about, it sounds kind of reasonable. For years I counted calories. Oh my goodness! Well, if we burn more calories than we take in, then we'll create a deficit. And I can understand how that theory came into being, except for the fact that our bodies are not calculators. So, they're significantly more complicated than that. We have these hormones that are communicating, and if we're eating too much sugar, then those hormones aren't working anymore, and they're also making us more hungry. So despite being full, we're craving things. And, so again, it's just too simplistic of a view for humans, because we're complex and layered, and so, I always say, well, if you want to count calories, which I highly discourage, I never count calories, I never recommend it. The one benefit you have is it stimulates your brain. Doing math is good for your brain. So
sure. But
that's
you can always
the one
do a
reason.
Sudoku puzzle.
And sometimes I do think, calories can be a little bit of an indicator. Like if you go out to a restaurant and you order, what you're thinking is a healthy salad, and you look at the menu and it has, that salad has 1,500 calories. That can be an indicator that, okay, something's maybe not right here when, I'm getting this many calories in what is this? So I think sometimes there can be a little bit of an indicator in calorie counts. Like if I'm eating, drinking 100 calories of pure sugar in a soda, and I compare that to 100 calories of broccoli with some grass-fed butter on it, that's an interesting way to look at calories. How am I spending my calories? It's not really just the calories, it's the type of calories we're eating and how our body's processing them. And, one of the things a lot of people think, if you Google the word metabolism, it'll come up saying, you need to eat every 2 hours to keep your metabolism up. Well, wait a minute, that really depends on what you're eating. If you're eating what a lot of people are eating every 2 hours is simple sugars, simple carbs, what that really is doing is keeping your blood sugar elevated, not your metabolism. And that's a real terrible thing for the metabolism. It doesn't allow the body to get into fat-burning mode. It keeps you in the sugar-burning mode. That raises your risk of all kinds of diseases. So it really comes down to what are we eating, the type of calories, the type of food we're putting in our body, how is that all affecting, everything else. And so, I think the calorie counting is very, very simplistic.
Well, Sarah, and I'm so glad you brought that up because, for instance, fast food, the industry, has now been required, at least in the state that I live in the Northwest, to put calorie content on their menus. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, you're in a fast food place. Does it really matter what the calorie count is when you're sitting there eating processed, cooked food?
Yeah.
Oh, crazy stuff.
Again, it's just part of that snapshot, that picture. You've got all the chemicals and toxins and the genetically modified. And that's part of the thing when I start to list all these things. We have to be worried about this and that, and it can sound very daunting. Well, wait a minute. I need to worry about whether food's genetically modified and what chemicals it has in it. And I think really the simplest thing is to say, just eat real food, cook more. I mean, like our grandparents, if they wanted cookies, they had to make them. We just go out and buy them. So I think that's one of the big differences is the convenience. It's, we have fast food places on every corner. I remember in the town I grew up in, I think there was one or two, It's just a difference in how we live. We're so busy, we're not cooking. And that's one of the things that I really recommend is to get into the kitchen. And, I think a lot of people have that fear is, I can't cook or I don't enjoy it. And I feel like once you start, I feel like the less time I spend in the kitchen, the more, I feel uncomfortable. The more time I spend in there, the more comfortable I get. And, I think...
Yeah, and it puts you in a creative mode, too, and it actually reduces stress.
Yes.
The book is The Perfect Metabolism Plan. It's how you can restore your energy and reach your ideal weight within 21 days to vibrant health. Sarah joining us here on the program, Sarah Vance. Is there a website our listeners can find out more about this?
Yes, you could go to Rebalance Life, REBALANCE, life.com. That's my company name. And I think also Sarah Vance gets there too, SARA, Vance, VANCE. So either one of those should get you to my website. I've got a lot of blog articles and some videos on there.
Well, there you go. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. You can also discover more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in, and remember, live your day past halfway.